Hello, everyone. It's been a while. Kind of. I mean, I think we were on last. Were we on last week, MJ? Did we do?
Nope.
No. Oh no, I remember now because we watched Black Panther. Right? That's what we did.
On Thursday, yes.
Yeah, and so we didn't stream. Oh, I love that John leaves when I say Black Panther. Maybe he's traumatized by all the poop talk from that we did for this episode in the beginning. I don't even remember that. This is a little behind the scenes stuff here. After we record a podcast, it like leaves my memory, and then I remember it after MJ says, "Hey, I finished like the timestamps. It's in SoundCloud, and I can add it into the essay." Because I write my essay or my responses to our podcast like a day after we record it, I think, and usually go pretty quickly. But yeah, welcome everyone. Welcome to. Thanks MJ for subscribing to the.
You're welcome.
Does that wait 26 months? How often do you do this? How I see this notification come up all the time, and I don't like. How often does this happen?
Well, it's like the middle of the month when it like
Oh, when it
refreshes, I
expires.
think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, we've got a fun show for you. Also, if you don't know, I'm Ethan M. Long.
And I'm MJ.
That's right. It's a big Ethan today because this is one of the first times in a while, where we're talking about something with the Discord with our friends and patrons and the chat. Hi, Port Couple. But we're not like reacting to a lookbook or like looking at things. We're just talking, and it's been a while since I've had like my face cam on, so this is crazy. But yeah, today we're gonna be discussing, and there's no sad head outfits today either, because this was kind of random, kind of just fits in with the schedule or with everyone's schedules. Also this Thursday I'm watching The Menu, so that's also another reason why I'm not streaming on Thursday. But today we're talking about this book right here. It's mirrored. Oh, it won't even my auto you guys have like it's blurring. Yeah, it's blurring, but it's Status and Culture by W. David Marx. It is from the author of Ambitora, and that's on here, Ambitora. And again, it keeps blurring because of the auto AI thing. But it's the guy who wrote. Well, my Ambitora is all the way over there. But we're going to be discussing this book today. And we've done it. If you guys are in the Discord, you guys know that we've been discussing this book, what seems to be like forever. It's kind of, as we say in the podcast and in the essay, which you guys should read, a little bit of rest.com or Sound Direction podcast. You'll know that this book was highly anticipated by a lot of us. And it kind of provides this kind of framework of thinking about culture. There's the great mystery of culture. And again, I read this before my New York trip, and I went to New York a month ago. And so forgive me if I don't remember things, but it's kind of like just talking about why people do things, and and how most of it is in pursuit of status, and that can mean a lot of different things, which you'll have to read the book and then listen to the podcast and then read the essay to get a full download of how at least me, MJ, and Spencer think about this. But we've got a couple of people. If you guys have any thoughts about this book, if you guys have read it, feel free to have questions or thought starters in the chat here. But we are joined by our good friend and top tier patron, Sidecast fanatic, Henrik Wilberg. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
I'm glad.
Time seeing. Yeah.
What's really funny is we have a section in Discord called Pod and Blog Discussion, and we've been kind of waiting for you to read this book and give thoughts. And what's also funny is someone messaged me on Instagram saying, "I'm very disappointed that you didn't ask Henrik to be on the podcast." And I said, "I don't think he's ready yet." Like just we haven't seen anything. And then funny enough, today, I guess you started it, right? Or did you actually finish the whole thing?
Well, no, not really. But there's I read like the introduction, the conclusion, and a couple of chapters, which is how most people get through the books, but yeah.
Is that how people do it? Is this like a cheat code to how to pass your class?
That is the classic cheat code to how to like not read shit for college classes. Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense kind of, right? Because I mean, if there's a book that has like a, there's like a point of view. If there's like a, they're trying to say something. I guess that makes sense compared to like, I don't know. You can't do that with a biology book, right? You can't just read about cells and I don't know what was the last section, animals. But yeah, I mean, but we've been talking about this for a long, or the idea of this for a long time, right? Like we've kind of hinted at it with our discussion on taste a while back. We've also talked about like the post-pandemic world and how how menswear and how the pandemic has affected not just trends but just how culture works and everything. I kind of remember us talking about like, didn't we say something about like, or I said something about how my dad watches like foreign films even though they're like basic and like actiony like compared to American ones because of the way culture is. And there's even a section in the podcast where Spencer and I just talk about movies for like half an hour.
I listened to that back on the weekend. It's maybe the more interesting thing to talk about is actually your take on it. Maybe as much as I have a fairly strong opposition to what Marx is doing in the book, but I do love the Amatora book. I love all like his other works, and I think it's like a great cultural commentator. I just don't think the thesis is neither that interesting, nor does it actually work. Like basically, if he's right, it's not very interesting, and if he's wrong, then other approaches that are better. But a lot of the other stuff that he talks about in more granular detail is much more interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
We can just sort of pick and choose where we want to start there, but
I mean, let's talk about like the grand mystery of culture here. Now, I know you said like right off the bat in our Discord like you just did not. I mean, you said both of it, right? You were opposed to it, and you also just didn't think it was interesting. What does that? What does that mean exactly? Like not interesting? Is it just like it's not as insightful as you had hoped it would be, or?
Basically, it adds very little to the stuff that he discusses. And I was sort of thinking he's joking. He's kind of bashful about this. Like he's like clearly feels quite bad about it that he has to frame it this way. And I know, I agree that there is a grand mystery of culture. There is no grand mystery of culture. Just to spoil that for you, there.
Yeah. He says he right in page XIII, page 8. He says here the grand mystery of culture. Why do humans collectively prefer certain practices and then years later move on to alternatives for no practical reason? I mean, yeah, I kind of felt like I was gonna not like this book when I was reading it. And not because, I mean, again, like we've said before, like when we talk about menswear, we do like to be social commentators. I mean, we all. I don't even think like I think with when it's classic menswear, there's a temptation to kind of be like, oh well, we're above this stuff. I don't think we don't try and do that. And I think it's just fun to kind of be insightful and kind of track things because of how classic menswear trends have moved, and I think there's some parallels to other stuff. But yeah, I mean, when I was reading this book, I was like, and maybe it's similar. I was kind of like, I don't think about that. Like, I think it, like it's like I think it's interesting to kind of have that rhetorical question, but I feel like right there, like for no practical reason, it's like, well, then you're kind of, I mean, like you're kind of starting on a weird premise right there. That's just me personally.
The way I understood it immediately is that he introduces this thesis of status as the key to all cultures immediately, but then kind of every other chapter undermines his thesis very directly. That there's no direct access to that status discourse that he discusses. It simply becomes this sort of quasi-anthropological underpinning, but then he actually talks about very specific things about like bourgeois Western modernity.
Right.
that are very sort of, and then he does show in very nice sensibility about the very dense historical context of that, and then but at no point the real critique is at no point does adding the status culture contribute to any of our understandings about any of these cultural phenomena that he discusses, not even the Lassie one. Adding the status discussion to that thing adds absolutely nothing to understand what happened with Lassie. It just becomes this sort of abstract or this sort of reductive way of thinking about culture, and that's not very attractive. Because it could be about anything. Right? It doesn't explain anything about the particulars of art historical development around pop art, the very specific decisions that were made. Adding status to that discussion doesn't explain any of the choices that those artists made.
Right.
That's internal to the system of art. That's a completely different discussion. Sort of the you touched on that in the pod. I remember when you were like how does culture get into the position that like a status reversal can even come into place? How is culture sort of primed for change? And status doesn't add anything to that discussion.
Yeah, it's almost. I mean, my
At most, it
yes.
retroactively provides an explanation.
Yes.
Why some people were able to do certain things, but it doesn't explain sort of why the Ramones wrote the kind of songs they did. It doesn't.
Yeah, that's. I mean, like that's like the whole. Yeah, you kind of described why I kind of had this whole issue with the book. It's because I mean, and the idea of it being retroactive is what I've kind of been talking about when it applies to me personally. Like, obviously, I mean, like, I'm not a history major. There's a lot of things I don't remember, and I'm not a culture historian either. But it's at least when I look at it through my own lens and see how status applies to myself, it's kind of like it. If I can't see how status was, a drawing figure in my decisions, I heavily doubt it for some other people, especially with art, because I don't think like no one. And again, maybe I'm being wrong. I'm just being absurd about it, but I just don't believe that everything is just kind of okay. Well, they did this, I'm gonna do this, and that's gonna make me more interesting to people. And the whole artist status aspect of it, or just counterculture for counterculture's sake. And maybe I'm reading this with that kind of bias, because I still think it's easy to read this book and just kind of reduce everything to just trying to vie for higher status. But there's always extra stuff involved, that's just, I wish there was more of it. I wish there was maybe more counter examples, or even a deeper dive into some examples. And again, like I said this in the pod too, where everything seems to be very Western focused, which maybe is kind of like not backpedaling, but just kind of like, well, he did Ambitora, which is again very Eastern focused, and seeing how that and how an Eastern, Asian culture adopts Western aesthetics. But there's a lot of other examples out there that might have added to his discussion on this, or had just a non-traditional, like, oh, here's a trend, here's the people who bought into it. It surprise, it usually has money or some kind of populist or art kind of focus to it or whatever. I just kind of wanted more. I want a better application of this.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wonder if the sort of Western focus is a strength or a weakness in a sense, because in a sense what he's talking about when he's talking about cultural change in that mode, he means capitalist modernity.
Yeah.
And the thing about capitalist modernity is it may have been like Western in its origins, but it's quickly become a sort of worldwide bourgeois culture that is sort of unstoppable in its own right, and that it tends to subsume everything, like how Marx describes this in the Communist Manifesto, like it drowns everything in the icy waters of calculation. Right. That's what it drowns every cultural specificity in it. So that might not be a the worst thing in a sense that transformation of our understanding of time that comes with modernity, aka like a capitalist transformation, is the only way we can understand the rhythms of change in culture now. Isn't an alternative to that anywhere. Since
Right.
we all share, time has been completely homogenized. It doesn't really matter where it started from,
Right.
it's Western or not, but time has been completely homogenized. There's no outside to the sort of the temporality that we currently live in. We'll share it in a certain way, for better or for worse. There's nothing particularly Western about that anymore, I
Right.
would say. So the framework for while there are of course still like counter-cyclical phenomena in cultures that sort of retain a pre-modern or basically it's basically sort of radical outsiderdom that doesn't really change that fundamental question, I think. But that's not the bigger thing. The bigger thing is the concessions that he himself make. Specifically, that status is, once he starts talking about Bourdieu in the book, like status has to be unconscious for that to work. Status isn't actually. It's more like economics than it is like a
Science.
social interaction.
Okay.
It's more like the hidden hand of the free market than it is like a conscious effort of individuals. Right?
Yeah.
It's the kind of rationality he wants to be that he wants to do. He constantly decide that he wants it both ways. So is the status seeking part actually hidden from the actors in the social field, or isn't it? And he sort of wants to have it both ways.
Yeah, that is interesting, because it's like, again, yeah, but when I was reading this, I always think, how much people are aware of, I guess not just the status they have, but like the status that they could have. And I feel like, it's interesting to just think of everything so transactionally, if that is the case. And I can't, like, when I look at the book and everything, and like you said, he kind of wants to have it both ways. It's kind of hard to do that when the book ends with suggestions on how to make status better, or at least give out good status where it should be, and as opposed to rewarding things that maybe don't deserve status. And I'm just from my reading of it all the time, and just my interaction with people, I don't like to believe that people are not just aware of of status, but like, I don't think people are absolutely motivated by it. Not because it's like a pessimistic way to view things, but I just think that people don't actually care sometimes. But
That's true, but
yeah,
but it doesn't. But Marx doesn't actually need that to be more charitable towards Marx. Is that it works more like the market in the sense of economics. That's like,
true.
you don't need people to do that. Basically, that the locus or the site of status isn't in the individual. It's in something like the marketplace. Right? Whatever people think in the economic market doesn't matter at all. What matters is the rational distribution of preferences through the market. So you don't need anyone to be aware of anything at all. You just need them to interact. And the aggregate of those actions would be the rational part of it. That would be the status side.
Right.
But Marx doesn't actually want to go that far, because that would undermine his thesis on the back end. That's saying that he does need people to be aware and conscious of their status, but even if it's only remotely partial. But even that, I don't think is correct. Even though I think it's better, has some more things in common with like economics in that sense, as much as it does with like a pure social game, because that's where he does make some concession to this, like basically how money and economics plays a role in it, and that is sort of the key to understanding, especially the historical origins of fashion or of sort of change, this sort of supposedly ephemeral or superfluous change or unpredictable itself. The way that people change their hairstyle, it's not a substantial thing, right?
Right.
But it is traceable to certain actors in a certain time and place, and the fact that these changes have become possible, and that's the most interesting concession maybe that Marx makes early in the book. Of course, no amount of evolutionary biology can explain why the Beatles chose to grow their hair long. That's completely self-contained social field that doesn't have an explanation in any kind of human biological or historical fundamentals. It's simply a change that becomes imbued with certain social forces.
Right.
And that's what he tries to explain. And status becomes sort of his own way to substitute a kind of a infrastructure for change. That's simply, in my opinion, that's simply just like begging the question, just replacing one thing by another. He might as well have said that it's evolutionary biology that made the Beatles grow their hair long. In terms of explanation, it's just equally valid and equally stupid in a certain way. What I would be interested in, more, and you are interested in a bit as well, is sort of why, what kind of system allows for an entirely sort of autonomous change like that to work that way. You don't need any like other explanation to do that, and that's like, and I mean, he talks about Bourdieu a little bit. There's another sort of social theory he doesn't talk about at all, which is a bit telling, which is sort of social systems theory, which says kind of the opposite about what David Marx says, namely that culture is actually a completely autonomous thing and can only be understood as a whole on its own terms. But I don't want to get too academic on that.
No, we can't. I mean, yeah, I haven't really looked into. I feel like I've heard of it from somewhere, but the social systems theory. But
it's a much. I mean, you can give a much denser description of what in fact is going on, because then it's much more dependent on media and the type of communication that allows for certain things to take, certain cultural significant actions to take place.
Right.
You don't get that unless you understand that the discourse of fashion as like an ephemeral change within appearances is sort of it is born in like 18th, 17th, 18th century aristocratic culture for a very specific reason, given the media available for that type of communication at the time. It becomes the way of communicating status, but that is sort of doesn't add that much to the explanation. One way to think about this is because we're fond of that, and also like the Derek guys are fond of talking about clothes and culture in terms of language, right?
Right.
Don't need language. History is completely useless to understand language, right?
Right.
You don't need to know the history of the English language in order to. Language is what is called a synchronous system. It is atemporal in the sense of what we're using right now. It doesn't help anything to understand an English sentence today. Your knowledge of Elizabethan English or Middle English adds nothing to that understanding of contemporary English. Even though we all know that contemporary English evolved from Middle English and Elizabethan English, right? You can trace precisely the meaning of words, the syntax, the grammar, and its development as a language, but none of that adds anything to the understanding of
to actually
language.
use it. Yeah.
Language is a self-enclosed synchronous system. Everything you need is right there in front of you. It's how it works right now that matters. Its history is kind of relevant. Even though we can do it. Right? So there's a difference between the sort of the historical or diachronic, as it's called, history of language, and its synchronous instantiation, which is everything that language really is at any given time. Yeah? So the social field is a bit like that as well. Like it's history at a certain point, interesting to explain it, but it doesn't actually add anything to the discussion of how it works, like right now. Huh?
Right, because I mean, it just feels like most of the stuff happened. I mean, it makes sense for the time it happened in, right? And then when it comes, I mean, it's hard to again look at the use the book and then look at things like today, and I guess that's why he has to have these caveat about the internet and how that kind of like ruined everything, or I guess ruin might be a strong word for some people, but like it kind of throws a wrench in status, and because things can have equal status that are diametrically opposed or just totally opposite, or just doesn't make any sense. Why they
No,
would be at
that's
the
the
same
funny
time.
part, yeah. Because here he concedes actually to systems theory, the media aspects of his theory, that actually the media is actually the determining factor here of how status is communicated. Once that changes, it's no longer. Then we're supposed to believe that's because what is the status theory really worth if it can be undermined by media? Then it's no longer like an anthropological truth, but it becomes contingent upon the communicative possibilities of any given age. It is, but then that means the status is not a great thesis for this.
I mean, I guess he does say, like, in the beginning of the book, right? Like this book could have been way longer, or I guess it is like, you do, I guess to set it up, and maybe he'll talk more about modern culture and modern status in the sequel to the weird sounds weird to say sequel to a book, but it's like the next iteration of this, because I think that some of the best discussion in the book happens about media at the end of the book, and the other part I also like it. I mean, I think that it probably also makes most sense is the whole old money, or I guess how much money and wealth and I guess literal capital play into showing status and your participation in culture. Like that to me was much more interesting, because like those are things that kind of, I don't know, I guess kind of throw a wrench in a traditional way of looking at culture. I guess it's kind of like, there's just like these other actors in it that just are more interesting, and maybe a bit more that I feel more antagonistic about, because I mean, to its credit, I don't like how the internet has changed culture too, but I think it also has worked out for us in a sense, versus if we were all for using men's as an example, to like all dress the way we do would not be as great if it was back then without the internet to bring us all together. But I don't know. There's still a lot. There's a lot in here.
Maybe we want to talk about your takeaways from it that you did in the pod and on the blog. I think maybe it's an interesting departure, so we can like make this a more less like a discussion about the book, but also about what we actually want from it. And your discussion of low status I found quite interesting.
Okay, so this is I guess I didn't talk about this too much in the pod, because that would have been its own thing. I do address it in the essay on my blog, littlebitrest.com. But I always, when I'm reading the book, I'm if I'm using this framework, and I definitely, we've talked about it before, because some other people in the Discord have read the book before I did. I was fascinated with the idea of lower status, and I think in the book, obviously there is a low status economically. There are people who are poor, so they can't participate in trends and participate in culture in the same way that, not just high status, but the middle class, like he says. The middle class is able to do all these things, and they have their own special small little rules that allow them to participate. But like they want to be high status, but they can only do things that are, not niche. What was it? Kitsch, right? There's the whole that aspect of it that's specifically for the middle class. But lower status, I mean, I like the idea, because this is like one of the first notes I wrote in my thing on it. But like lower status has free movement because they have nothing left to lose, and the distinction is more. It's more than like just rule breaking, but the idea that you are respected for non-participation or counterculture it comes with like elite privilege, which isn't always given to lower status. Usually it comes in, the middle class and everything. Like again, for example, like obviously like lower status people don't participate in fashion trends, but we're not celebrating that the same way that maybe that we would be like, oh well, we're not buying Shein either, right? But like it's cooler for a fashion guy to do that than a person who just literally isn't participating. But I like that idea of lower status because it's not just about me thinking of myself in high school. I think it's just about like how much regard culture has for me, and I've always operated on the fact that I feel like I have no lasting power in things, and maybe because my metric for what lasting power is or what a cultural movement can be is a lot higher than MJ wearing a collar bar. And maybe it's because when I look at everything from a menswear perspective, and I've seen how much effect Derek or Ethan or any of these other guys that we all look at, I can't say the same thing for myself. And so when I'm reading this book, it's kind of like, okay, well, I can see myself in the lower status aspect of how trends move through menswear culture. And I will say it still today, where when we look at what sadcore is or whatever we do in our Discord, or that's kind of like the common theme, if you want to call it that, it doesn't seem to be very specific, at least not coming from me. It seems to be like just a conglomeration of everything that we just like. It's true that there is no real separation of sadcore versus the current hashtag menswear. The only difference is that it's the people who happen to listen to the podcast also. So just that aspect of like low status, I was like, yeah, I see that. I like this. And it's, the idea that you can do something and really have nothing to lose really does speak to whatever privilege that people critique me having, because it's just, I don't feel like I don't have the privilege of high status where I can do whatever I want. I don't see it that way. I feel like when there's a difference between that aspect of it and whatever lower status has, and I feel more in common with lower status. Yeah, that was kind of a lot, but I feel like that was my main take. That's the main thing I liked from the book, that I felt like had the most applicable, that I actually kind of liked, that applied to me. And it was interesting. It's also interesting that people call me out for it, because it's like people don't believe I have low status. Yeah, what were your thoughts on like low status? I mean, if there were any.
Yeah, it's a bit, yeah, you call it, it's a bit bizarre actually to call. I mean, my understanding of how low status works in this case would be more in like but this is not the worst case to bring in like the social analysis that Pierre Bourdieu brought in, right? Mm-hmm. Because he has a very clear, fantastic thing about that book. It's called like the distinction. It's not a book that most people read. It's like 1,000 pages or more. Huh? Mm-hmm. but the best thing about that book is like it's a kind of an exhaustive analysis of low status taste.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And the point of that book is basically to form a very powerful criticism of like the classical idea of taste, which is taste that has developed sort of like the bourgeois classic Western concept of taste, like since the Enlightenment, which is that taste is basically removed from material reality. Taste is separate from every other aspect of life. Mm-hmm. In the words of the Enlightenment, that is like a disinterested pleasure. The pleasure that you take in an object without anything else involved in it. It's not like material desire, sexual desire, even like a good taste, literally, as in food. Mm-hmm. It's this type of, it's just its own thing. That is a very historically unique thing that happens in the 17th century late 17th century, 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that art is its own thing. It's separated from religious devotion. It's separated from material, sensual pleasure. It becomes its own element. And it's and in order to, and that is the point at which superior bourgeois taste is kind of born, namely that taste is everything that's not vulgar, everything that's at a remove from the material, physical, bodily interests, and also anything that can be converted into any other kind of interest is not aesthetics.
Right.
The aesthetic moment in European history is sort of born at that moment, and it sort of spreads from there, and that becomes then a sign, basically, as the more removed you are from material constraints, the more aesthetic you are. So the finest of arts is the one that's at the furthest remove from material necessity. And even something like conspicuous consumption comes from this, because like buying something completely useless, you demonstrate your independence from economic constraints.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the model of good taste, is basically to demonstrate that you're not servitude to economic necessity.
Right.
And that is like the very definition of high status in terms of taste, but also in terms economically sort of follows from that. That's sort of the classic origin story of like what we call aesthetics. And that it's different from everything else as an autonomous field. Now, the way that relates to lower status is that lower status then becomes defined as the people who are trapped in like a material, straightforward, utilitarian view of culture. Everything from comfort food to but anything that demonstrates like aesthetic remove is actually participating in like bourgeois culture almost independently on actually how much wealth or thing you have. That's how like bohemian artists in the 19th century can enter into, even if they're dirt poor, like a lot of them were, they subscribe to this ideal of aesthetics, which is completely disregarding economic necessity.
Mm-hmm.
So the modern modern art is also participates in this ideal of completely unbeholden to economic necessity. And the paradox is then, of course, that's the paradox of like bourgeois aesthetics, is that in order to be independent from in order to disregard economics, you have to be economically powerful.
Right.
And that can be imitated in a certain sense, and it can't even be outright bought, but it is available to people that way. Yeah? But to be truly low status in Bourdieu's terms, it's a little bit more is required, namely that you're basically up against a constraint that you don't quite understand. Like in the sense that the classic example is being confronted with a piece of modern art that the only way you have of responding to it is by recourse to either like your personal experience or what you're completely unable to comprehend something as beautiful that isn't literally like physically or aesthetically pleasing. That's a famous example that Bourdieu does in his book. He shows this like particular intricate photography of like a car crash, I think. Mm-hmm. He asks people from every like according to education, he asks like a few hundred people basically about their impressions of it, and sort of almost like clockwork, people depending on their education answer accordingly. Like, I don't know about that, I wouldn't like to be in that situation, like I don't drive my car like that. And then it sends through the ranks of society according to education, like middle age, like the middle school teacher can sort of begins to express an interest in the aesthetics of the painting, whereas the higher level junior executives and high school teachers express like a true aesthetic appreciation, namely that they can appreciate the beauty of something that is sort of objectively ugly or something like that. So the question is, how does that come about? How does people, and Bourdieu's thesis is that, of course, that is not just learned behavior, that is like an active policing of taste. So you have to learn to look at art that way.
Right.
So true low status is someone who is unable to separate the form of mensur. That would be someone who is like unable to separate like any like practical utility from any
like aesthetically,
like aesthetically or formal or design aspect of it. Whereas it's less, I guess, about the power of influence here in terms of status, in terms of where you fall on the spectrum of aesthetic education.
Right.
Bourdieu's like final clincher of the thesis that a lot of like bourgeois classic taste, far from being removed from material reality, simply basically class weaponry to gatekeep, to use a modern parlance, keep art becomes basically a weapon, something that's weaponized against low status people, that they see something that is obviously going on behind their back that they're unable to understand, and it makes them mostly angry.
Right.
You say if people, like you say, when people on different forums are confronted with certain things,
right,
beyond the comprehension, like the understanding is basically incomprehension, rage, ridicule, or something like that. When there's like sense, it's like a typical, for Bourdieu, like particular low status response is that to express either incomprehension or exasperation at something.
Right.
Like that.
I mean, great recent example is Permanent Style's article on wearing loafers with jeans and it getting just torn apart at MFA. So I guess, with this, I guess for me, an expanded view of what low status is. I mean, I guess when I think about it, I guess I just think of like maybe lower than ideal or lower than where status should be, because I do think that when we look, and maybe I just wish this from Marx, where when we get to how much the internet has changed how we view culture, or how things proliferate through culture, I honestly think that it affects how we view status as well, which I think maybe that's my whole thing of how we ascribe things in this new age, because it can't just be education level, at least when it comes to, I guess, pop, not just pop culture, but like just like, I don't know, hobbyist culture, because there are some things I don't think that you have to necessarily be educated about and get to be able to achieve high status. I mean, maybe to us they will be low status, if we think of like influencers, wearing joggers, but I feel like it's hard. We have Poetry and Prejudice here saying 20K Instagram followers isn't low status, but then yet we could still view an influencer as having low status for wearing joggers or something very maybe not in good taste, but they can enjoy a lot of things of a lot of qualities of high status, and the benefits of high status. And I feel like that it's hard to argue that they're not also high status in some regard. I feel like there just at the very least, there needs to be a splintering of different types of low status. And maybe that's what I'm trying to convince other people about myself. Because, I mean, if we're thinking of just education level, I feel like I'm very middle class compared to some other people, just for the sake of not having a conventional education in the whole menswear mix, and certainly not as much as some of the people I guess look up to, or the people I consider to be colleagues in the media space, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I feel like the discussion on low culture has kind of permeated through every discussion on this book because of how I view it, at least in regards to myself. The reason why I think that, or the reason why I want to focus on that, is because I think if the book has a conclusion in how to dole out higher status or good esteem to people who deserve it, I think there's some kind of parallel there to kind of changing how people look within look at menswear. We've talked a little bit about evangelism before, and getting other, and just the basics of getting people into this hobby, because it doesn't make much sense for us to just, not to say that we can't just enjoy it for what it is, but there is an inherent or just draw for other people to kind of come in, and of course this community aspect of it. And I feel like talking about low status in that regard is important, because if we operate on the education level, it just seems very top down, and it gets very easy for the mistakes to repeat again, I guess, in whatever new version of
this is like, what is the correct sort of proxy for class distinction? No?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There you go.
And the thing about, of course, Bourdieu is writing about like 1960s, 1970s France.
Right.
So what is really interesting is like mapping out the whole field. Less interesting, like defining what makes someone low class, basically to observe the whole range of differentiation that happens within the social field.
Right.
So art becomes this mechanism to sort people according to class, that isn't income or something. It becomes basically but what matters for Bourdieu is basically that there are other modes of distinction that are parallel to other ones. One is, of course, like direct income. We can compare how much money anyone makes. So that's another. That's like an economic ladder that you can compare. But as everyone knows, like some people with new money can be low in cultural status, and vice versa. Depending on the dynamic of the culture you're in, right?
Right.
So what matters in the analysis is, again, is not like any kind of fixed. You're not going to get to like a fixed like Marx status thesis. You don't get to use education basically as a true definition of what low status is. What matters is the sorting process within the cultural or the field of taste. And then things can change very rapidly. Like one of the most interesting things about reading the book is like basically how food is sorted out in France, which is completely different from America. But you can observe even from the 70s and 80s that, for instance, cooking has migrated from being like a low status activity to a high status one.
Right.
So the way people think about food is probably, I would say maybe food now is a more active status or more active class indicator.
Absolutely.
Than most other things in American life. I would be what you eat, where you eat it, is probably the most reliable indicator of it, in the way that art maybe used to be.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like you can't even compare it to clothing, because I mean, with clothing you could I don't know, who was I talking about this, but I said something about like you can thrift something good, but you can't like stumble your way into like really good taste food. I mean, not to say that's impossible, but I mean, it's just, I can't think of an equivalent of like, finding or getting like a ring jacket on discount.
Exactly. You just can't do that.
Food.
You can't.
Yeah.
What is that? Like no one's.
You can't get Wagyu for the price of a burger or whatever. I mean, I guess
someone has been pointing this out. Someone has been pointing this out that we have regressed sort of to the food stage of maybe for the last decade, I would say, like especially in American culture, that food has been the most dynamic cultural field. Both in terms of innovation and spread and so on, because there's no way to no other thing that people are maybe intimidated by some aspect of menswear.
Mhm.
It does not compare to like taking someone who has never been to a nice restaurant, the kind of existential terror they're subjected to.
Yeah.
If you want them to go to like to have a tasting menu or an omakase in at like fine restaurants like the ones you went to. Huh? So there's your answer towards your high-low status question. Huh? These are definitely in terms of mobility within the social field.
Right. I mean, but we're talking about like mobility,
Just to
social
integrate,
field, and like what's interesting, if a lot of the discussion about this book is based on my interpretation, how it applies to me and everything. What I think is so funny is that the metric of following on social media is often used, and what I think is kind of crazy, and meaning bizarre, is that like I always just saw it as like just a natural progression of the groups I've been a part of, and I wonder how that applies to like status conversations, because it's like if I were to really think about this, and I try and hint at it in the blog post, because I've talked about this before, and I don't want to be too reductive or regressive, but like I think people forget that I've been doing different things for such a long time. And if we think about like when we were talking about like the Disney bounding part of it, like I was a big part of, I was like an active participant in that thing, and I wasn't a famous person for that, but it kind of went from there to like just to vintage and everything. And I think it's easy to look at, I guess, following or whatever as like this metric of higher status, but it just, to me, it just seems like there's like people who've just stayed for that long, and there's just so many different types of people that represent who follows, because I don't think, like, I wasn't at this level of participation in the menswear industry or community until, I don't know, maybe like 3 years ago, maybe. And I think maybe it's because I worked at Ascot Chang, and I feel like that aspect, like, I mean, that's not even that, I wasn't even like I was in pursuit of status. This is what makes it hard for me to understand if everything is like, well, status is like the motivator for certain things. I feel like if I really wanted to, the real way would to be like working in tech or whatever, and then just buying all the menswear that I liked, as opposed to the opposite way of like maybe like of working in it. But even then, I didn't buy Ascot Chang a lot because it was still very expensive for me, and it still is now. I still haven't spent until recently like $300 on a single shirt. Like, that was, I've never been able to do that until I had to get out of it, and it's just interesting. I mean, again, maybe I'm viewing the status wrong, but I'm trying to work within the whole framework of the book here, and to kind of evaluate myself and my participation in menswear culture, because I don't know why, but if I always look at it in terms of like the effect that you have on other people, and the effect that and if you can actually tell that it's there, because I feel like when we look at the examples here, where you can see an actual progression of people adopting a certain thing, or people following, let's say, old money, for example, right? People, they're kind of inspired how new money does it. Of course, new money does it differently, and there's conspicuous consumption and everything like that. And so it's hard for me, and I'm not saying that when people say high status for me, or when I look at what high status is, I'm not saying that the jump is from wherever I am to old money, but I do think there needs to be some evaluation in how we look at status in the internet realm, and it's more than just class distinction. Because I feel like status in the internet time just kind of means so many different things to so many different people, and even if we try and if we try and find like one cohesive way, I feel like we could find an example that throws it out of the water. Like, again, we can talk about influencers, or just the fact that things can be simultaneously high status or in the zeitgeist at the same time without any rhyme or reason. That I guess conventionally, maybe that's just the effect that the internet or media has.
Yeah, one of those are two things. One is sort of the sense that a lot of people that voice. I think I voiced this at some point as well. That the internet age sort of beginning with the 2010s sort of has sort of permanently shifted what was sort of previously perceived to be like a certain cycles of trend. It's both been accelerated and slowed down at the same time.
Right.
In the sense that the real innovation has somehow slowed down. There's actually, Marx says this, I think, too, that there's like the speed of innovation has actually slowed down in the
we're like
age.
Static now or something like that.
It's stasis. Whereas what we can call like the epicycles are like spinning faster and faster, like things coming. People are sort of cannibalizing the very recent past, and right now we have reached like Y2K style as sort of the final frontier of pre-internet style, or the cusp of internet age style has now been fully absorbed into the zeitgeist, whereas we're still doing like 70s style and certain 80s elements, and Ivy style is still here, and old preppy style is still here, and all that stuff. So this sort of hyper contemporaneity of everything, whereas there is no actual technological movement in terms of the cyclical nature of trends. But on the other hand, you have the actual impact of the internet age on like the social field, basically how, in Marx's words, like how status is filtered through online culture, as online culture is no longer distinct from real life. And here I'm not so sure. I don't know. I feel like that's the social field that both Marx and Bourdieu sort of believe are still in place is still working. There's a clear distinction, between vulgar influencers that have like hundreds of thousands of followers, but are clearly peddling some sort of scam or another.
Well, I was about to talk about that because
then you have like whereas like middle level influencers in terms of follower count and engagement or whatever, which are clearly which are those kind of accounts that are picked up by other media that can get like a feature in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal style column or something that can sort of create or sort of link up with sort of pre-internet legacy media.
I was I was about to say this because what I've noticed when I've noticed about, I guess, influencer culture is that despite it being kind of like a new, I guess, groundbreaking way to think about status in the internet age, the benefits that you get from it always tend to be traditional. Like, I mean, the easiest example I can think of is how, like, when TikTok became a thing, right? All the biggest TikTokers made YouTube accounts, and that's because at least at the time, you could not monetize your TikTok easily, and the best way to do that was to go on YouTube, right? Because you would be paid, right, to get ads on your not just like placements, but like you can be paid to just exist on YouTube because you're keeping people on the platform, and you're a YouTuber and you get like the AdSense and everything like that. Obviously, TikTok has done something similar to that now with the Creator Fund, but it's always so funny to see whatever this new version of how we deal out status still reverts back to old school benefits. I mean, even at the end of the day, right, when you have all these influencers going to these influencer dinners, right? They're like, you could compare those to like just like salons back in the day, like, oh, let's invite all the cool people to have dinner together, like it's always trying to just put things in a more tangible way. And if I think about it and how it applies to me or my view on status, I'm like, well, if you don't get to do those things, then you're not really in the same status realm as these other people. And I remember talking to I'm not going to say his name, but there's a TikToker we all know, and when I was asking him about how it feels to be in this whole, to be in this new realm of life, he knew that it was kind of still fake. He knew that he still had to find some way to make it tangible, and to kind of get regular status benefits, because otherwise he knew that it meant nothing. And that's how I kind of view internet culture, where it's so surprising that we focus so much on this, and it's like, oh yeah, people are famous, but it doesn't really give you anything. I think I made this connotation in the Discord, where I say it's kind of like online dating, where, not to knock people who do online dating, but like at a certain point for me, when I was doing it, I'm like, if you don't meet up, it still feels fake. Like there needs to be something tangible involved. Whether that's like setting a date in the future that you can actually meet up or whatever, but there's, at least at this point, I feel like the internet age, despite it kind of like throwing a wrench in the works of status, still feels like it's not the answer, because you can't get the actual benefits of higher status from it without doing something else. And maybe it's just a vehicle to get there. It's just a faster way to get to traditional status. Yeah. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just not convinced that it is like something that's completely different. If there is something that is completely different, is what I've talked about before. That basically the infrastructure of influencer culture is like monopolistic in like the tech industry notion of the term, the sense of the term. So there isn't actually, you don't actually have any real autonomy over it. You are in servitude to the whatever the algorithm is in that sense, and which influencers are in terms of driving engagement. I don't really know or care that much about it. It's like vaguely fascinating when you get to that level, but I don't see that as very distinct from like classical notions of. Still, nobody has actually made anyone able to ride influencer culture into like a true like cultural respectability. I don't think so.
Yeah.
No artist has done that. That has not happened. Probably for a similar reason, that sort of the older institutions are still. I mean, if anyone, maybe like the guys who like go to do like heavyweight boxing and shit, even though there's influencer and now they're like boxers. Maybe that's the closest thing where you can get like get someone to co-sign your influence. But I don't see that as a real thing. What has changed is that as late as like the early 2000s or the mid 2000s, there was still this resistance to was then called like the resistance to selling out, right? That there was a status differentiation, or there was like a distinction in the social sense in terms of where you distributed your artistic or whatever output you had.
Right. There's a Marx.
I remember I just listened to this book about like 2000s era rock music, like the indie band wave of the early 2000s, and you have these bands like turning down millions of dollars from major music labels. They had $1 million in offer and they turn it down because they don't want to be on a major label.
Right.
And that sort of idea of resistance to selling out is sort of that probably died with that last millennial Gen X ethos.
Right. Because I mean,
of true counterculture that is still where you can still derive status from or distinction from non-engagement. That doesn't really work online. Online it works like vaguely in the sense that you have like mid accounts that are like maybe between like my size and yours, I guess, sort of between the in like from like close to six figures, but or a little bit above, that maybe you find some good stuff there, but and that there's like a certain, maybe there is like a certain cachet in not being, a six-figure following account or something.
Right.
Because then things just fall, obviously things fall apart. Yeah.
So are we saying then that like if we think that the era of that kind of resistance to engaging with the old systems, like it is it are we saying we're looking at that favorably now? Because I feel like I feel like I've seen that, right? We always say like getting the bag, right? Like you can't blame someone for getting the bag now, and I maybe that's because it's a very liberal way to look at things, right? Very like working within the system, right? Like the more we are aware of capitalism's grasp on society, it's like, well, if you can't escape it, might as well benefit by using it, right? And maybe now even if people reject that idea, it's still met with skepticism, right? Because I feel like there are times with this book we might see like, well, then they're if you're reading this book and you see someone reject, I don't know, a brand deal like that, you'd be like, well, they're just trying to get status within their own people. I feel like it's got a little bit not reductive, but I feel like you can't. That reasoning doesn't work anymore, so people are just drawn toward just accepting the fate and just participating in it.
Yeah, without paying. But the question is, are they not paying a penalty in terms of social distinction? I wonder. Because I think there is a barrier to true. I think a lot of influencers find this out. There is a barrier.
Yeah,
there is a true barrier there to the highest echelons of cultural acceptance, of high bourgeois acceptance. Still, like the resistance to the market and the resistance to influencer culture is still there.
True.
Maybe, but on the other hand, that is a kind of the story of the internet, even from the early 2000s to here. Like, the way you really make money, or the way you really succeed on the internet is by converting it into old money or like old currency. And if you fail to do, and the people who fail to do that, like the latest installment is that weirdo crypto nerd who lost all his money.
Yeah, that's
because he missed the boat. He was unable. Although from what I understand, he frantically tried to convert it into like normal banking financial systems because that's his only way of converting,
having lasting power afterwards,
converting something into lasting. So and it's still to this day like Twitter and Instagram has to be converted into old money currency because there really isn't that much there in terms of independent media structure. Maybe YouTube is an exception. I just don't know, but it just doesn't seem to be like to have actually change the dynamic of that much. It is obvious to me that when people start, like certain TikTokers that we follow start endorsing certain products, is that immediately this is like deeply uncool.
Well, the funny thing is, right? I was about to say this about like
this cannot be done. No?
Maybe we should talk a little bit about social distinction as a form of status, or I guess maybe the better word is a benefit or esteem. I think esteem. Marx talks about esteem, but it's it's funny because like despite us thinking it's uncool, it doesn't. That idea now of being uncool doesn't stop people from doing things. And as I kind of alluded to earlier,
Marx says that too. Yeah, it's true that the age of cool is over. Marx suggests, right? Because things are much less cool than they were because you say like the inhibitors are no longer there in terms of. Well,
because I mean, and again, maybe this is like kind of hinting back what I said about like getting the bag, where like it doesn't matter how uncool something is because at the end of the day, if they're trying to secure old status or traditional status through wealth, it's kind of hard to knock, which then makes it kind of gives them leeway in their uncool decisions. And I think that is kind of been one of the factors of what makes the internet age maybe slightly different, right? Like where it just, there is no deterrent anymore. And yeah, again, like you said, like that there is death of cool, and what does cool even mean nowadays? If it's not, you know, held to the same esteem. I actually, a guy messaged me, or no, sorry, I think he commented on my on the blog, on the podcast Instagram, saying that, you know, he was thinking a lot about as he's reading the book, he thinks that cool, Marx seems to think that cool status is a social phenomenon rather than an individual one. And while I think that used to be the case, I feel like the only way for it to go is for cool to become personal, because it's just, what's cool to other people just doesn't make sense anymore. You know, it has no real definition, because people can enjoy the benefits of being cool without actually being cool. Cool, or maybe the reverse of it, being cool doesn't really get you anywhere anymore. At least that's how I read it. That's how I see things today. You know, it doesn't matter how.
I wonder if it ever got you anywhere. Cool.
That's true. That's true.
Cool just made you cool. That's kind of the beauty of it is that so what was always the specter that's always haunted like bourgeois culture was like its own triumph, right?
Right.
If like bourgeois culture, namely the capitalist culture that replaced aristocratic distinction, that really would win out, basically, that the coolest people would be the ones who were the wealthiest, like the most influential, the people with the most cultural capital will also be the one who just had the most money. The fact that has never worked out that way is sort of I guess to humanity's credit in a certain sense. It's always like that's sort of the paradox that I was trying to allude to earlier, that what bourgeois culture fears most of all is kind of itself. It says, and if you can see, maybe you can see this in internet culture as well. Like what internet culture sort of cannot truly abide is that if the algorithm really wins out, like if the algorithm in fact starts working perfectly, that would actually be in the end of social media, right?
Right.
When there wouldn't actually be anything that is at cross currents to that production of engagement, then it really wouldn't really be an interesting distinction between individuals and bots, and cool would be no more. There has to be this reserve, and that you see that very from the very beginning, like in the 18th century, that sort of this remnant of aristocracy within bourgeois culture, which is kind of what cultural capital is. That it's still in a certain. So the question is, to what extent do we still live in like a court society where that social or cultural capital still is able to assert itself, that you can like be able to shame the person with the most money because he does not know about certain cultural things. So,
Right.
And that distinction, if that distinction is no longer made, what truly would kill cool is that if there wasn't a distinction, if the policing of taste no longer works. If you cannot shame the person with influencer for 1 million, if calling them like a sellout doesn't have any effect at all, or if calling them vulgar doesn't work anymore, so that there isn't like a counter example of someone who doesn't promote this product on their feed, if there isn't like another example of that, then I don't see that happening quite yet. Although there are some certain inklings. I see it sometimes in younger Zoomers among students or something who no longer care about the differences of like different levels of taste.
That is,
Like,
yeah, it is a younger. I guess maybe that's why I see it, right? Like again, like I think younger people. That's why they say like you got to get the bag, right? Like I think there is there's no shame
I think
in the influencer culture that I used to feel like. You know what I like? It's just it's interesting. It's weird.
I think I'm also about this goes back to like this notion of kitsch, where
Oh yeah.
basically the distinction between art and kitsch is kind of no longer operative.
Right.
Um, uh, uh, it's funny. One of the examples Bourdieu mentions in his book about art, his sections about art, is that people with the lowest education can only relate art to themselves and their own experience. Right?
Mm-hmm.
For Bourdieu, that's in the French system of education. That's a clear sign of low status. If you're unable to consider the artwork as an autonomous statement that doesn't relate to you necessarily in any particular way, but has its own internal order and is to be judged on its own terms of what it's trying to do, rather than your opinion and what it says to you and your immediate impressions of it. So if you start comparing a story or a work of art or a film like to your own experience, that's a clear sign, according to Bourdieu, of low status engagement with culture. And I observe that among some students of mine, that they no longer perceive that difference. And like in that a contemplation of the formal characteristic of an artwork on its own terms, they don't see why that is more important or more worthwhile than their own direct take on it.
Right. I mean, yeah, we didn't meant to say something similar about like, you know, if you enjoy the Marvel movie, like that's not enough,
Yeah,
right?
or even like you see like larger swaths of even middle class culture like succumb to what you would call like moral kitsch, basically basically like moral content, like basically the statement or the positioning, or like of quote unquote like woke art is basically evaluated on the terms what kind of position they take in the in like the moral political landscape.
Yeah.
And that is like the sole metric of, or at least that's alone justifies something like a work of art or the nature of a film, that it achieves something in the field of representation rather than in the field of film, right? That is an example of kitsch. Clearly, I mean, you can say that Bourdieu is wrong, but according to standard bourgeois field, that is a clear example of low status engagement and kitsch.
Right.
The collapse of a regime of taste.
I mean,
Now, according to Marx, you would think that, okay, is that a democratic?
oh, okay, yeah.
Does that represent a democratization of art? Because Bourdieu is very clear that, because when I tell my students you have to consider art as a formal exercise on its own terms, that is a way of policing the classic bourgeois regime of aesthetics. You force students to do a formal analysis because that is the correct way of engaging with work of art, and that is the touchstone of proper bourgeois disinterested aesthetics. It's got nothing to do with you and your personal life. There's a beautiful object in its own term, and it's good for you to consider it on its own terms.
Right.
And that is that is the policing of that. So when that collapses, the question that Marx asks at the end of his book is the question: is that a democratization when it collapses, or is it, as he suggests, and I would tend to agree with him, what you want is to retain the aristocratic structure without the actual material barriers to it. Which is an interesting take, and it, there's nothing within like history to sort of say that's wrong. That's sort of because there is a larger scale defense of it, which mainly that that type of artistic endeavor gives us an image of freedom or something that is like more than a reflection of ourselves, but still. And you can sort of I know you want to translate that to the realm of menswear, right? Whether the collapse, when old money is no longer able to enforce its aesthetics, it has two options. Either it becomes itself a kind of incarnation of low status culture, which is what Ivy style is, right?
Right.
This idea of forcing or refusing to consider, or the inability to distinguish expression that doesn't follow the rules, or that doesn't
It's not
remain
grounded.
recognizably
Yeah.
remain recognizably within the parameters of what style is. That is a true collapse, kind of a disaster of old money culture when it becomes
I mean,
isolated like that.
there's a famous example of, you know, that you and I got sucked into where we, you know, we're not inherently J. Crew haters here, but I feel like, you know, when we dislike J. Crew, it
Yes,
has nothing to do with well, I guess we're looking at it from an aesthetic point of view, where the only defenses I saw of it were, oh well, I can afford it, and I'm like, well, that's not what we're talking about here. Like, that's not it. Just as an aesthetic garment, it just does, to me, it just does not look good. I mean, specifically the Ludlow suit, and you know, that was like, yeah, the first time I've had to be like, what happened to any discussions on jacket or on the design of garments at this point? Like, I was like, what has happened to, I guess, menswear culture, or I guess, you know, I guess as Mark, you know,
Yeah.
the book, it's like in general, like, what's going on here? Like, why are we abandoning this, or at the very least, why are we putting it at the same level? Like, why are the metrics at the same level, or regarding the same level, I should say? And that was just so, I guess, frustrating, you know, and just bizarre that we've gotten to that point. And so if we relate it to, like, you know, again, the future of menswear, and you know, as I think about how I view the future of it and how other people might get into it, because I guess for a long time I just assumed people never got into menswear because of the cost. But of course, as I got older and with like thrifting, I think, okay, cost is not exactly the you know, the barrier. It really is about, you know, aesthetics, and then about, and I guess, knowledge of what makes aesthetics good. But then, you know, as we move, you know, as things get easier to disseminate this information and make it easier for other people, we lose, like, as they said, like, you know, we kind of lose that distinction where it abandons those old school, like, or I guess the bourgeois rules. And I wonder if or how we can apply the Marxist solution. I mean, not really a solution, just the ideal would be to be able to keep those rules without it what was it, without like the gatekeeping, I guess. I wonder how that actually works, because I wonder if the audience or the rest of the world is actually open to doing that. It doesn't seem so far like it's possible, because then we just get, you know, people defending fast fashion, right? It doesn't seem like we've gotten there. It just seems like it might be getting a little bit worse.
Yeah, because you get this truly bizarre position of, yes, defending basically warding off perceived privilege at all costs, basically.
Right.
And you do see that in kind of been a kind of argument that's plagued sort of high culture for some time, and the fact that it's sort of got to clothes is, I guess what's new is that there hasn't really been something like Shane before, like something so outrageously cheap in terms of we had H&M in the 2000s, but that was like to the sort of the beginnings of fast fashion.
Right.
Not something that can sort of undermine something to that extent. I don't know. I'm always like a little skeptical towards the kind of, if there's like anything to be done, or this, if they have the very idea that there's like a we that has like the ability to change too much around these things. I have a kind of that's me, like a kind of like a passive quietist
Yeah.
version about this, sort of my own my own position is that it's more like, okay, you can at some point, for whatever reason, there was an opening in our lives at some point where clothes could come to play a certain role, and we engage with in a particular way. And that's what sort of slowly led us to that way. You can't really lead people onto that unless there is like some sort of capture some moment that allows you to perceive things differently. That's kind of always like that. Like if someone from a but it happens. But the truth is, it happens like less and less. That there aren't really, except in very specific genres, there really isn't working class art. Doesn't really exist anymore. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just sort of working class people who come from the working classes are pretty much universally excluded from artistic fields, and that doesn't really exist anymore. In a way that also like working class life has sort of disappeared from films, or disappeared from, you can sort of say well that whatever you want, but it's a fact, and you can't really lament it, but you can't really actually find an expression or some sort of outreach that would change that. But I know we're different there. You are more of an evangelist or a, what did I call you once? That's like a true popularizer.
Yeah, I guess
more than
so.
more than I am, in the sense that you genuinely have like a genuinely open open action. I mean, I have partly of that as well as like a teacher or something, if someone would come to ask, and I have like certain commitment to like a radical equality of capacity. That's there's nothing in terms of like genuine appreciation or capacity that prevents people from engaging with certain things. But
I mean, the reason I have that, I don't know, I feel like it's not that anyone can get into this. I genuinely think that everyone likes clothes. I mean, I think it's hard, like, when you read the book, right? Everyone wants to have some kind of status, right? So if we're operating on that aspect, then I think everyone likes clothes, and I feel like it just takes the right person to unlock. Sounds like the bad term to use, because it's not like I'm not trying to convince. This is why I guess evangelism isn't the right word, because you're not trying to actively convince them to do it. I think it's just, I find at least the people that I've encountered that I've successfully brought into menswear is that they've always liked it. They just they lack the it's not even understanding, because I feel like they have like the basics of aesthetics already in there. They just, I don't know, maybe encouragement is the right word, or just a sense of, I mean, I still don't agree with using the word community either, because I feel like that has a status thing. I think that they just need someone to talk to about this stuff, and to know that, I guess, if community is a thing, then I guess they're not alone in thinking of such things, Like, I think, and this is kind of goes back to what I was talking about me getting into menswear, because again, it's easy to look at menswear as like another hobby to get into, which I do want it to become, but when I got into it, it was not in that way. I mean, like, it was weird back then to have a guy who was into clothes, not in a homophobic way. It wasn't really a thing outside of very eclectic people, because like, it's not about it being functional. It just wasn't a thing. At least I wasn't aware of it in my very close circle, and being in a Christian university or whatever. It just so happened.
This is what interests me a little bit, actually. This part. It's also the one main quibble, I suppose, I have with some of your approach to things. It's precisely this idea of the hobby.
I mean,
actually, if there's anything that actually designates your approach as not aristocratic, it's this.
Yeah, I mean,
It's this acknowledgments that it's a hobby among others, or that things sort of that being into clothes is just like being into like music scores, or just like being into Star Wars or whatever.
right.
I think that's not true.
I mean, I can
If you,
see why for other people it's not true. Like, I think in the grand scheme of fashion and or clothing and what it is, yeah, I do agree that it doesn't, my view doesn't work with it. But I think if we take my experience and then we take the people who have had similar experiences, who are not, I mean, some of them might have been in a similar background of, like, you know, growing up Christian and being in a private school, but that's not always the case. I think it just happens to resonate with people who are so far removed, and this is why I think of low status, where clothing outside of practicality is so superfluous and so just unnecessary that it is like a hobby to them, or it's considered that because it doesn't offer them anything. Like,
this is where you're right. This is where that reflection of that one, that's not a judgment or anything, but that is clearly a low, sort of like a low distinction or a low status position to have.
Yeah. I mean, it's
you're right about that.
That's what I've been trying to get at, because it's like, and again, like, the only way people can connect with it in that way is if it is like a hobby to them, because like there is, like, I can't, like, if I know MJ's just listening, he's probably playing video games, but it's like there is no other way for me to convince him to do it, because the basics of how we dressed got us by with whatever. Maybe not like high status, but again, this is not like when we were younger, and especially if we had uniform, or if you know, I guess even if you shopped at the mall, because we weren't exactly growing up at the time where there was like this big distinction between like bad clothes and good clothes, or even like cheap versus expensive. Like, that stuff was still rooted in formality, and so at least from what I've seen in my generation, it was like, you know, what we wore got us by, and that was fine. You had like you could wear, you know, you had like the one suit or whatever. It's very practical. And so the only persuasive argument to make is that if you just think of it like anything else that you enjoy that is not useful, like video games that you spend money on and you participate in, that might have a couple of friends in there, it just makes sense. It just works within this thing. And maybe this is the whole generational thing of why my views get critiqued from people who are usually older than me, or did not live in a situation where that was the case. And again, I also acknowledge the fact that I did grow up Christian. I had uniforms for a lot of this stuff, so, you know, the actual effect of being teased for your shoe choice and participating in that way wasn't really a thing because of how uniform everything was. But I still think that there was still something out there that we knew were signifiers of cool and status. It just wasn't clothes. And that's why it's so hard for me to think of it that way, because like now, like, there is a cheat code to being cool in menswear, and it just so happens that those things are kind of what I liked. But when I got into it, those are cheat codes to not being cool, or to not getting that. I mean,
I think I understand a bit, and it's also it's sort of visible, and kind of you can sort of trace that from your every time you sort of, in your essays, you go back and sort of track or trace your journey sort of through to way to this particular stylistic point, and something like this is how you got there. Every time it's like, yeah, that's very, very different from my experience, both generationally, maybe also class-wise to a certain extent. Even though I know my own background is not like high class, but it's like, I would say my background is more like classically upper middle class, like bourgeois aspirational, maybe, like at least in certain parts.
Right.
And it was you know, clear for me from very young age that even though I wasn't actually sort of active in clothes in any way, but observing clothes being like a difference maker in certain subcultures that I admired, to see that clearly articulated early on was, of course, extremely
I mean,
extremely formative. It was like just seeing like the like the soccer hooligans wearing Burberry to
right.
like the early like skater wear of the 90s that my older brother was onto. So to just see that clothing could do that, or sort of be like a real anchor for those things, and to in a sense sort of be like windows to a different world at that point. Yeah?
I did. That is interesting because I mean, I guess I got to get more into that. You know, obviously the older I became, which is why it's almost when I look at my clothing choices, it's still a rejection of it, but like not in the same way of like what I have that paragraph in the blog where I say like it's not about being counterculture, and to me that doesn't mean or I say that because it's not like I was joining the counterculture by doing this. It was that it's like a rejection of all the available choices, and not even to just create a new subculture in whatever area I was, whether that was, I guess, college when I started the blog, or but it just was about like just kind of diving deep into whatever it was. I mean, it could be, you know, it sounds bad, but like it's almost like being like a furry, but like not knowing that like other furries exist or something, right? It's like but you know that you like it, and you know that you can consume this type of, I guess, kink online, but like, you know, it doesn't really do you any favors to do it. And if you're also aware that no one else around you is like that, it just throws the whole thing of like, well, you know, you're not really like trying to go it, like you're not trying to increase your esteem by joining something new. It's just you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot by doing something that you know is not really rewarded in that way. Because I still was, you know, like you said with the soccer hooligans and everything, like I still kind of got more of that in college. Obviously, when you see more free dress or whatever, you know, and or I guess when you start entering the dating landscape. But there is that idea of, you know, you can see archetypes, and maybe because I was on the outside of it for so long, or not outside, maybe I was just rejecting participation because obviously I kind of knew, right, if I wanted to be with my friends. And I should have bought the Pokemon T-shirts, right? I should have done that if I wanted to fully be engrossed in this thing, or you know, I could see how I mean, there's the whole Swagapino aspect that I've talked about too, where like, you know, the Obey T-shirts and the snapbacks that I still saw, and or even like, you know, as things got older, the kind of like Abercrombie meets, I guess, like Asian attire, where like guys were wearing like polo shirts with like cargo shorts and the flip-flops or the boat shoes with like a puka shell necklace. Is kind of like very like Asian frat guy kind of thing that was kind of coming about when I was like finishing high school. So I still kind of saw this kind of stuff when they had the opportunities to see it when we weren't wearing uniform, obviously. But it still was like there was no gateway for me to do it. And again, maybe I don't know why that is. And you know, maybe there's just kind of doubling down on being, it wasn't even, you know, I don't want to say it's about being different, because I feel like maybe it's just kind of like, it's almost a defeatist mindset. It's almost like taking the red or maybe even the black pill socially, of like, you know, well, if I'm not, if I know I don't like this stuff, and I can't do it, even though I know it's available at the mall, like it's not like it's inaccessible to me. There is something weird there about just this exact rejection of the other avenues, and that's where I think low status is, where it's just like, I mean, and low status is in being aware of the things you could take, but just decidedly not doing it. You know, and, you know, it's like it's weird now, right? To like, you know, to be the guy who looks at art and to only have your own experience, and with everything around you kind of giving it to you, right? We're in an age where everyone's a critic, and there's so many, you know, avenues to become educated about something, and yet actively rejecting that is weird. But I see that as like, you know, me kind of doing that back then, and then just kind of finding my way into menswear, you know, randomly, and for a long time it wasn't a community until I maybe met Spencer and did the whole vintage thing, because before that it was a very solitary hobby that no one was into. And the interesting part about the Christian background of this is that it's not exactly recognizable as like its own fashion thing, because you still look like you're trying to be professional, right? And if you're like a 20-year-old guy, like, okay, you're not wearing a tie in a trad way looks like business or business attire. It doesn't there's nothing to signal that, oh, you're into fashion. This is like an artistic hobby, even though it is for you. And then as you add the Christian aspect to it, you're like, okay, well, now you're just like a guy who like a youth pastor vibe, right? Like there are these people who just, they like to dress up, they look professional, and that signals something else that it might not be accurate about you. And so it's just, the hobby aspect of it is kind of a maybe putting that exact rejection of convention into words of like, well, I like it, and that's why it because I like it, it is a hobby. So that's what it is. There is nothing else to it, because it's not like the other things that are related to menswear, aka looking professional or whatever. And I don't think I would have gotten there without this particular background, because I think most people who do get into it have a more traditional thing, and I think people are aware of other subcultures that kind of do it, right? Like, I mean, there are preps in most colleges, right? There's an aspirational aspect of it, or at least the gateway to the other world. But if you don't see that available to you, it just becomes superfluous. It becomes like a costume to adopt, right? If no one else does that. And not to say that there probably weren't East Coast people in my college, because obviously my friend Raj was kind of like that. But I mean, yeah, I mean, out of everyone else wearing an OCBD, he was like, the only one wearing it in like a proper way who wasn't faculty, So it's, reading the book and having this as the background is interesting, because it does make me wonder like how much of this is I like using the word unique, because I feel like there is something here that other people can kind of gravitate toward. Maybe that's just like, when I think of like nerds as like the classical sense of being of this kind of like being outside of the conventional culture, and I know that nowadays nerd means a different thing, but like there is something there to how I engage with menswear that is similar to how the classical nerd archetype would get into like Star Wars or something, because it just goes hand in hand for some reason. There's just something similar of the draw there. That's also still different than like maybe saying like a guy who like getting into watching sports because of all the facts. Like there are guys who get into menswear because of like the quality aspect, and who get into it because of the, they want to like to I guess nerd out on something. But there's maybe the cosplay aspect is more applicable there, where like doing cosplay really doesn't really give you anything other than maybe displaying your own obsession with that particular subject. Until I mean, unless if you were unaware of conventions at the time, and I guess for me, menswear, that was the menswear experience. There wasn't like a trunk show. Like I never knew what that was, or I know that could be a thing. And even now, you don't really. It's kind of frowned upon to go to a trunk show and not buy anything, right? Like you're not really, I mean, that's why they do appointments nowadays. But like there isn't that as much celebration of the hobby, like a conventional nerd or fandom thing. There is still the kind of like gatekeepy aspect of menswear where like, well, you can only really wear a tuxedo because you're going somewhere fancy, or you're going to a nice dinner or whatever. But that obviously changes now, which kind of throws a wrench into everything, because now there's people go to Pity or whatever, or people. I mean, me in New York, everyone hangs out, and it becomes kind of a convention of sorts, which I feel like also works in my favor of how I look at it. It's the same thing as when I walk in Little Tokyo and I see the cosplayers hanging out in cosplay outside of a convention. There is no other reason to do it other than we all like it and we all know each other.
Yeah, I do appreciate, but this is the impression that I have, and that shows me that I'm not. And that is odd in a way, and that is it. You're right, I think, in the way that is sort of a unique, possibly sort of a unique feature of age of not just the internet, because that's kind of but it's the age of like specific internet architecture of subcultures where you can do that. You know?
Do you think it kind of depends on how you get into the hobby? Because I feel like, I obviously the appreciation of film score is not a new thing, right? That's kind of been, I mean, it's always been really niche, but I feel like there is a similar aspect there where, and I feel like in most cases, people who like film score are people who maybe like the ideas of classical music, but who maybe aren't exposed to classical music very often. So, like me, where like film score kind of replaces that a little bit. There aren't a lot of, I guess, old film score heads who are classical music people first who happen to like film score, because I feel like if you like classical music, you probably don't like film score. It literally is kind of like a pastiche of classical ideas, and as I'm trying to educate myself as I go to more symphonies, I definitely get that aspect now. I get why, it's looked at as a kind of a nerdy thing to do, I guess, because it's kind of like pop culture versus like the art of it. And I feel like if I had a more experience with classical music, maybe I wouldn't like film score as much. Just like if I had a more traditional relationship with clothing, maybe I wouldn't have this view of it.
That is weird, because that is like a truly bizarre thing about you.
Yeah, no,
it's almost like obtusively anti-cool to be into.
Right, and that's how I see the whole, like, I mean, like, yeah, the low status, because you have the freedom to do whatever you want, and with like no real repercussions, because nothing really changes. Like I mean, that's what happened. Maybe not low status is not the right word, but uncool, because if you're uncool, you have no coolness to lose. So, it might as well go all in on whatever the heck it is. It's kind of like, I mean, I feel like that's why a lot of, like, maybe my friends just go full send into their hobbies, because what else is there to, they have nothing else to not that they have nothing else to do, but there's just, there is no esteem to be lost, and the good thing about this, about maybe what they're into, is that it doesn't really affect their job stuff. And for me, I guess I've been privileged to just be in positions where my appreciation of this this uncool way of looking at menswear, and this uncool way of participating in it, does not have any repercussions either. Okay, maybe that's strong to say. Maybe it's
no,
not
I
as
understand,
yeah.
I understand it, but in a way we're completely different, a diametrical opposite, but also very similar, in the sense that we probably have a very similar attitude to, say, our actual like online presence or something, that it's not something that is we live or die by in any sense. So.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
I don't. But for me, it comes from a different place, in the sense that I still don't consider like online presence real or important in any real way. It's amusing and sometimes more time consuming than others, but it's not really. It's completely bizarre to me that people are like deeply invested in.
Yeah.
In like an online presence, that they get into fights online or something like that. It's impossible.
Right.
Possible for me, but coming from a very different background, because for me the clothing was opposite of that, in the sense that it was always it was not like a self-referential sort of like nerdy pursuit that then just became like an internet presence. It was something that always was a bridge to the outside in a certain way, and was never just a hobby or isolated from any other social pursuit. It was part of music. Like, one of my music tastes, I'm more like a stereotypical like record collector guy. Like, what did I like when I was 18, 19 years old? It was like Northern Soul, or 70s reggae, or 80s British mod pop and stuff like that. Like, kind of the classics, but sort of that had like a certain tradition of cool, but it was like an apprenticeship in a certain way. It was kind of like a pathway, and it pointed to other things, and clothes were part of that. So when clothes became a possibility, sort of an avenue of possible, sort of something that you could spend some time on. It connected to that. It was never something that was nerdy, isolated pursuit. Although I did see people, I do remember very distinctly talking about low status, and we talked about touchables in your essay, that it was like a moment, certain age, where I could see friends that I have grown up with kind of sink into the pit of untouchables because nerdy pursuits got the better of them.
Right.
And I sort of consciously escaped those things.
I mean,
that was like,
yeah.
was easy to see. Like, I remember I haven't really seen it since, but I remember like some friends of mine like started playing with like magic cards or whatever.
Yeah.
So like, and I just remember telling, you cannot do this. If you do this, there's no coming back from this.
Right. I mean,
it doesn't matter what your taste in music, all of that is going to unravel if you do this. And they did not listen, and they did not come back from that.
That's interesting, because it goes kind of against what people say, or I guess it is the recent discussion we had where like people can be equally. I mean, we have a guy who played Yu-Gi-Oh professionally, right, for a couple of years, and now is at one of the cooler stores in menswear right now. And so, you know, but like that idea of and not just untouchables, but like, you know, like seeing any kind of pursuit as a gateway to something else maybe is something that a very fundamentalist Christian area does not have, because maybe there's like that subtle rejection of the world, right? Where like pursuits maybe mean nothing, because in the end all that matters is if you're going to heaven or hell, right? Or something like that. And so maybe there's that subconscious aspect, but like it doesn't breed nihilism for some reason, because there is still cool, I mean, at least from what I remember, there's still the distinction between cool, nerdy, and, or I guess, untouchable. These like different status signifiers, and they're still tied to something. They're still tied to the old school way of looking at it. I mean, I'm sure that there's like the subtle things of like what shoes you wore and your, you know, what sports you played, etc. But, and maybe I just, I don't know. I think I do think that, you know, because Christian culture is like usually behind everything else, there's also this idea that it's like it just retains so many old school class distinctions. So it's hard for me not to see any kind of superfluous activity that is not deemed already cool by other things as anything more than a hobby. Like, I think that with like let's think of like skateboarding, for example, right? Like that's kind of a fundamentally cool thing, or, you know, counterculture, whatever you want to call it. And I think within Christian circles, even if no one around you skateboarded, you still feel like it's cool because of how Christians might perceive skateboarders to be, you know? Like there is this kind of like detached, or this like removed relationship that just kind of enhances the appeal of it, or whatever. So it's like, as you get older and maybe you do those things, there, you know, it just happens to be that clothing just never really caught up until much later. It still was kind of rooted in either being just too professional or too very Christian-y, nerdy guy wearing a tie, like, you know, Book of Mormon style or whatever. And so that idea of like, you know, why, you know, going too far down the pit is kind of just, I guess it's exacerbated by how closed off this system is from other things. And I also think I'm over exaggerating how closed off it was, because I feel like, I mean, we still participated in pop. I mean, we still like watch Star Wars. Like, it's not like we were removed from everything and we only heard about Star Wars through random kids at the mall or something. There was still this kind of direct relationship there. Yeah, recognizing what was cool, or what could, you know, what is aspirational, is just something that my friends and I just kind of rejected. I don't know. MJ, come back here. We need some insight here about like our friends and everything, about why, yeah, about why this happens. But like,
it's just lucky. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, it just seems to be like, because I mean, like you said, Henrik, like, you know, like about kind of getting into this way, then kind of the whole internet culture thing came later. I mean, that kind of was always a weird thing that happened. I mean, if we think about like about stat, I think one thing that I was in pursuit of status is that I kind of wasn't not an early adopter, but I was kind of always in the new wave of certain social medias. That was kind of like a thing I didn't expect things to like kind of pop off, but I did. Like, I had Tumblr back in like 2008 or 9, but I still got it from other people. I feel like other cooler people were in it, but then I didn't use Tumblr or MySpace, whatever, in the same way that they did. I used it in my own nerdy way. It just kind of became another outlet for that nerdy pursuit. Perhaps because we can't do it at school where you have uniform. They're like, you can't bring Yu-Gi-Oh cards to school because they're satanic and they would get confiscated. Yeah. And so maybe that this whole thing.
I got the gambling one, not the other one, but that was kind of funny.
The what?
Oh, you can't bring cards because it's gambling.
Oh, you got gambling. Yeah, I had the whole they're satanic beasts illustrated on this. But there's that idea of maybe. I guess I did realize that the internet was an avenue to express your nerdy thing, but because of that aspect, I have that same idea of yours where the internet means nothing. Because if my hobby is considered to be kind of nothing, or to be low status or untouchable stat, whatever you want to call it, to other people, then my use of the internet in that way is the same. And it just so happened that there was an audience for that stuff, and I'm not even talking just about fashion. I'm talking about like I can't look at my old Tumblr because there's bad stuff on it, but there are times when I was recently looking at this with my girlfriend, and like I made like Disney like GIFs of Disney and just stuff that I liked from Disney, and naturally like Dapper Day and vintage stuff kind of came after that. But like even no matter how many notes you got from this, and maybe it's the fact I recognize that other people are anonymous, like they're not real friends. I'm very outside of this Discord. I'm still very aware of like the parasocial relationship on the internet. I don't want to feel like I know anybody or that I'm beholden to whatever. I always kept in the back of my mind, like, if a girl, or to bring back to the dating thing, if a girl thought I was cute on the internet, I'm like, well, you're not real. Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. I want an actual person to tell me this, And so that idea has always been there, and it's and if we tie influencer culture and the pursuit of high status in relation to the internet, it still means like nothing to me because it doesn't affect how I engage with everything. Like, if it's like the more followers I got on Tumblr didn't stop me, or the more menswear guys I got as I started posting fit pics didn't stop how much Disney content I posted, because it doesn't mean anything. Just like today, where I feel bad whenever I post a take on film scores because I know no one cares, but that's even more of a reason to do it, because there is no detriment. I don't lose my clothing does not benefit from cool points. There is no esteem to be had, and so it doesn't really matter. Like just because a fit pick didn't get as much likes as the previous one doesn't mean I'm gonna stop wearing that beret in that way or whatever. And I think most people don't look at it that way. I don't think anyone in our Discord thinks about it that way. But I think convention, especially when you look at, to bring it back to the book, if you're aware of these things, it makes it an odd decision to make if you are aware of your cool points or just the esteem that you can have for certain activities you take. But yeah.
Yes, it's true. I mean, oddly maybe in a similar situation, being sort of in academia, sort of the way I am, where there's absolutely zero benefit to be had from something like this. Although, who knows? I mean, whenever someone I know, sort of somewhat professionally, or friends of mine are in the same area, sort of find out that this is something that I do, and also, when they discover it on social media directly or indirectly or something, it's always incomprehension.
Well, I mean, that's the funny part, right? Where,
yes.
like, even
But
in
that I
a
like.
yeah. There's just like, I mean, you would expect, right? Like everyone I meet to kind of just get this, but like everyone is still just like, why? Like, and maybe there's this weird fascination I have with retaining the status that I have, where um there's the rejection I have of like doing sponsorships, and that's not to say that like it's easy, right, for us to say no to some random influencer bait stuff, like I don't know, fucking
Manscaped.
Manscaped or performance chinos, that message everyone. But then it gets harder when, say, the things that you actually like start to message you, right? I mean, we kind of, I mean, we had an influencer pod, I don't know, I guess 2 years ago, and I know that we talked about, with the Bone Fracture and through No Man Walks Alone, um, and it is. I don't get those because maybe I also don't buy from brands very often. So there's still there's still an aspect of monetary gatekeeping that happens to me. I physically, I can't, like, maybe if I bought a lot of clothes at the Armory, maybe they would say, hey, we got these new ties, would you want to have one so you could post it? Like, that can't happen because I don't shop at the Armory enough for that to ever to be a thing. It's kind of like how I have a friend of mine who she's very wealthy, and she gets a lot of free food, but that's because she goes to these restaurants a lot, and she makes friends with them because she's eating there a lot. And not to minimize her friendships or relationships with these people, but a person who can't do that will not have those relationships. And I guess for me, it's just funny that these relationships happen almost randomly, because, or not randomly, but just unconventionally, just by my participation in the culture. It is odd, and so it makes my future rejection of these things not harder, because they still don't happen as often, but it does make me wonder what effect it has, especially when some of us are, you know, I would argue my Discord gets more benefits from stuff the more than I do, more, I guess, more conventional benefits from this kind of thing, unless you count a conversation with Mark Cho a benefit of my status, which I don't. I feel like if he just happened to be in New York or Japan or London, wherever
Yeah,
he's there.
that's the difference
Yeah.
between high and low status. For high status, it's just things that happen. For low status, it's just
Sure.
something that it's just something that's beyond comprehension. That
Yeah,
it's
that
just
and that yeah, that might be
it's
it.
inner machinations you are just not privy to. You can just nothing
Yeah. So it
you can
is.
do. How does it happen? Who knows?
Yeah, it is. I don't have like, a definitive, not really answer, but just like, like why I even do things. I mean, I try. The whole blog is an exercise in me trying to figure out why I do things. It's my own status and culture for myself. Um,
Mm.
and it only gets harder to do that the more we know, because it's I can say that I liked berets from, seeing old photos from 1930s artists and just random guys in Europe and illustrations, but then it's harder now when I'm also aware that I saw it on Reddit, or from people that I became friends with, and it's harder to see how much of it is still from that low status aspect of my, or perceived low status of my life, because, as you said before, I try and tie things back to that era a lot, because I do want to know how much of it is from that guy and how much of it has changed. And at this point, a lot of it is still rooted in that old guy, like the spear points, the foulards, the big pants, the thin bells, etc. Not too much of it is that new. Um, and when I was reading the book, I do think about how, like, there is that it's almost like, I guess, cultural patina, maybe, like you want to show that this thing has stayed with you for that amount of time, so it has more authenticity versus, a new thing, right? I like that idea in the book. I definitely think there was a missed opportunity, or maybe in the future, to kind of to talk about how much things have stuck with you, and maybe that's one draw for me today, where I feel like I dress exactly the same, not just um stylistic, or like proportionally, but like when I think about it, like I don't have like as much of a casual style right now. Like formality speaking. Like, I don't wear my chore coats and jeans as much to do my trousers. And there was a time where when I first got into menswear and vintage, where I didn't have vintage jeans back then. I didn't really even have sport shirts. So all I did to participate in the menswear hobby was by wearing my pinned collars and my fedoras and my sweater vests and my big jackets. And I feel like I've come back to that. And I do wonder if this is just kind of like who I was the whole time, or just kind of proof to have that cultural patina, right? It's like you want to have your old Mercedes out so people know that you have an old Mercedes, um, as opposed to, uh, having the I guess a Tesla or something. I don't know, but like there is that idea of authenticity that still is my draw, and and the best part is that that old stuff is still not cool. So it kind of works out cyclically, where it just I get to kind of remain in this area because I like maybe I am aware that like when I wore a beanie with like big jeans and a jungle jacket, I was trying a little too hard to be Tony Sylvester. And even though if I like that and I saw that before, maybe it was just it's still too new. So the best thing to do is kind of go back to the thing that's got some rust, aka, again, I literally bought a leisure jacket because I used to wear Hollywood jackets, and it's a belted corduroy. It's a little bit different, but the ethos is still there. Or, you know, I'm thrifting, dark, point collar shirts from the '90s because there is still the aspect of like prom involved, but also like, when I only had H&M shirts, I would still wear those, dark blue shirts with my vintage because that's the only dress shirt I had. And so like there's that kind of coming full circle and kind of remaining where I am. And I think that's important to do so just to kind of show that it is a hobby, because when a hobby becomes a job, it becomes something, it takes on a different, or not just a job, but like if a hobby becomes, I don't know what the higher version of it is, but like I feel like it removes it, it removes how personal it can be. And how
Yeah.
like just it loses something when it's not a hobby anymore, when you realize how much of it can affect other things. And so if you can remain in a place where your hobby is a hobby not by your enjoyment, but it's independence of your life, like if you can think of menswear as like being like cosplay, where anyone can be a cosplayer now, right? Like you do that shit on weekends. Or I think we talked about how you can be a competitive Yu-Gi-Oh player but also be a fucking lawyer or something like that. Like that's what I want from it, because once it becomes something like where, okay, well, if I wore this, I wouldn't get dates, or I wouldn't get the promotion, or I would get something, whatever, like my friends would be this or whatever, like that makes it different. That makes it something else entirely, that prevents maybe you from being a little bit authentic, or to kind of to get the cultural patina of your hobby, where it becomes just really about you. It just it loses that aspect where you don't get to participate in the same way.
I guess that was never. This is maybe I'm trying to figure out whether we differ on this or not. Because to me,
Yeah.
the hobby is very clearly demarcated as something that's like not. It is like a separate thing from the rest of your life, right? As this thing that could be otherwise, and that's just not how I think about clothing at all.
Right.
Never been how I think about clothing, and it's certainly not an ideal that I would pursue. Instead, clothing is what's the best way to wait? I kind of have to let the dog out of my room. Sorry.
No, I can vamp a little bit too. No, I think
one thing out from like that. Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I think that aspect of it being not separate. I don't know. I feel like that's one reason why I had to, not had to, but I left the menswear industry. I feel like I wanted that distinction. I didn't want to. I actually, maybe I didn't like the idea that, oh, you just work in it, Ethan. Like, that's your excuse. You don't have to. You don't have to. Oh, here we go. You don't have to deal with the connotations of wearing menswear like the rest of us because it's your job. And I did not like that. I hated that that comment, because I was like, I can't win in that argument, right? Like, it's like you know, I guess I could see it the same way. It's like, oh, like it might be cringy for you to be. I mean, it's like I don't know, maybe it's like a video gamer where like it's kind of an insult, right? Like if you're like a full-time streamer, like, oh, well, you wouldn't play that if you didn't work, if it wasn't your full-time job. It's like, no, I just
Yeah.
want to like I want to prove that I just like this, and maybe that's just me being sucked into a dumb argument, but I feel like that's definitely at play where like I at some point I wanted to prove that this is a hobby, and it is. But the best way to do that is where it's like you have no excuse other than it being completely superfluous. And maybe my definition of it being superfluous is that it adds nothing of value and it doesn't really detract from your life versus while for other people that might be a thing where they just happen to be in positions where it can't be just a hobby because it is in constant conversation with the regular world around them, right? It is like it'd be hard to be into menswear if you were a factory worker or a mechanic or something that involves, I don't know why I picked those two things, but like something that involves like a uniform, for example. And so it just to be able to get to a position, and maybe this is more my privilege of literally being middle class and and maybe I guess working and becoming a part of becoming bourgeois, by getting a higher paying job where you're independent of that. But then of course there are still other bourgeois people who still have to deal with the connotations of clothing. Um, as we said, as I tried to say in our Discord, I guess it's true. People just can't wear whatever they want versus where I feel like that's kind of the case.
Mm.
But
Yeah, that's something. What you want. This is the idea. I try to express this like when I was on someone's podcast. I can't remember which podcast that was that I bizarrely got invited to and did. But when I thought about like what actually my relationship to dressing or clothing, or especially items of clothing is, when I talk about authenticity, what that would be to me, that it has like, it is like an historical engagement more than anything else.
mhm.
It's a bit bizarre, and I don't. Maybe it took me a long time to understand like how different that is from most people's approach to dressing. But that I don't mean like any kind of period authenticity or something like that. But
Right.
it's like a particular connection that I value within each thing. Like there is like that can be like, if you look at something like a beret or something, why do I wear berets? Huh?
Mhm.
I mean, I did see growing up. I did see people wearing berets, like some artists and some weirdos in my surroundings that did wear them,
Mhm.
and I thought that was cool. And it had a connection to other things that I did like, which would be like 1950s jazz or something like that. That I was interested in. But it's not what I did. What I wanted by that was not necessarily to uh,
You wouldn't want to
to
dress like them.
I wouldn't dress like it. I didn't want to replicate it, but I did want like what I would say, like within the life that I was already living, I wanted like a vector that pointed sort of in that direction, not just as like a direct reference, but something that it was like more that 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 sort of felt sort of meaningful.
Do you think it was like a
Uh,
self-fulfilling prophecy? Like if my life could be like that if I have that garment, and like again, like not in the replication.
no, it was simply, it was nothing basically more than that type of. Actually, I have a similar way now that I like. I finally found like a proper like 1980s Brooks Brothers shirt.
Mm-hmm.
I had like bought a couple of others that were just weirder. They weren't like what I was told and what they were supposed to be.
Right.
I found a good one. It's like, okay, now I finally have this sort of, okay, now I actually have a um
The real one.
the real one, the cut and stuff that I want, not in this sort of abstract collector's item, because the classic collector's ethos is to withdraw something from circulation or from display, right? Or something that you
Uh-huh.
on
Uh-huh.
its own, right? Whereas what I more likely wanted to do was to return myself basically into something like uh, that historical connection, if that makes sense. Maybe I'm not making too much sense about that now, but uh, so that you can sort of dress for history in this way, that everything becomes intentional and meaningful from that angle, and not from from like the already pre-established meaningful connection itself that you want to dress like something.
Right.
So the patina sort of comes directly from the many different uh, embedded historical layers that it comes with each garment, which is why I'm not very interested in more recent clothing. Not really, huh?
Right.
Unless they have some sort of, unless I can extend that sort of continuum um, of what I'm doing. Yeah, that's also, but that has helped to get me to a place that's similar to yours in the sense that it has very very little to do with others.
Yeah.
It has also practically almost nothing in the sense that I don't genuinely, not just that I don't care, it's that it is sort of part of the status, like conscious or unconscious. It's that I have noticed that it doesn't occur to me that other people actually have opinions about how I dress.
Right.
That's sort of something that's something that plays no role in what I choose to do, and in fact, it kind of extends to other parts of my life as well. Probably not always the healthiest in the sense that I have like a fundamental disregard for it, which is of course a reflection of a certain privilege.
I mean, yeah,
But
I was about to say, like, I mean, in a slightly similar vein, it's like it's been odd to track. And I mean, we do have to finish out here. I know. I'm sorry, MJ. We've been waiting. Our friends have been waiting. But um, there is this weird aspect of even after I have gotten to this level, it's that how still how not just how little I regard other people's opinions of how I dress, but how I don't come into contact with those opinions very often outside of the internet. And it's been wild because I'm thinking about it now, like my first like quote like real job or whatever, like I was an intern for this accounting agency that I knew from like a friend from I guess church. So I guess maybe it's the Christian aspect, whatever. Let's just but like that doesn't stop them from like I mean they could have had like a bigger agency, but like the CPA firm was just like three people. It just happened to be like that. It was just like one of those like local things. I just I didn't get the position at I didn't get the internship at like Bank of America. Like I just whatever. And so
road not taken.
yeah, but it was like, like even in that particular aspect, like maybe like a formative moment of my life where I would have to be business casual or whatever. And at this time, I was into vintage. I wasn't really into hashtag menswear, but I kind of got into it as I tried to find the middle ground between what I liked and what was contemporary. Um, I still like no one cared because they're not going to let an 18 or I guess I don't know how old, 18, 19-year-old guy like talk to CPA clients or tax whatever. Like I'm not doing anything. So I was still removed. And then we think about today where I'm now in a more LA job independent of my Christian background or whatever, but yet I work from home and I still don't have to be directly involved with people and it just so happens that my job doesn't have cameras on as a mandatory thing, which is it's still very some people choose to have it on, some people choose to have it off. I turn it on randomly if I feel like it or if I whatever. But like I'm still so far removed from this, and I know obviously it comes from a place of privilege because obviously if I had a different job or other people might not be in a position to be able to do that, to have that kind of freedom of other people's opinions of your physical or I guess your attire. And but that removal kind of reinforces how much of a hobby this is because of how insular it can be. And then when you get to put this out into the world, MJ said about luck. It just so happens that now, as I am an adult and I'm going out, it's now accepted to do that. It's fine to be the guy wearing the suit and the tie, or I guess maybe that's still kind of weird. But like if we talk about like the high waisted pants, white socks, and panty loafers, there isn't as much stigma as there was back then, or maybe not stigma, maybe it's just more common now. No matter where in LA, because I feel like you still see with thanks to TikTok, right? Guys are thrifting Bass Weegians or the Doc Martin loafers and wearing it with like their white socks. I mean, we're wearing the same socks, but, me and these teenagers. But like, I'm sure if this was any time else, if I started to get into white socks and I was, I don't know, an intern at KPMG, for example, I probably would not have been able to do that. But it's just the trajectory that life has been. But I also don't believe in doing things just for the experience. Not because I don't like strife, but I feel like that's just a hollow way to do it. It feels like you're then become you're literally like reviewing life, which I don't like. Like I'm not gonna try and get a job where I'm forced to to um to be in office, just so I can know what it's like for people to react to my clothing when it's gonna be uh another detriment to my life, like commuting, for example. But
Yeah.
it is funny to kind of look at all of this, and to see how much of this applies and how much of this is really, I guess, unique to me, but again, not unique to the kind of people that that gravitate toward me, and I gravitate towards. And the Discord is kind of interesting because it was kind of proof that people didn't have to be like me to kind of get into it in the same way, which is honestly the most surprising part about this. Like, again, like if we talk about not just MJ, but people like my friend Adam, who did not grow up Christian, but he was a kind of a nerd, and he went to public school, and he's now a film editor, which is kind of an insular job, right? You're kind of just by yourself for most of it. But this kind of becoming by virtue of being a film editor, you're also kind of a film critic, and so you kind of have this like armchair social commentator kind of vibe. And then of course, and you organize things and trends into aesthetics, into groups of people, and you kind of just get there. I thought that you'd have to be like that to get into this, and I think we all kind of have some similar vibes. But the Discord is proof that you can even be further removed from that kind of archetype of person, um, or even just having a similar background, and still kind of get into the same expression. But as I still find out, the ethos behind it, or at least the guiding principle, is I guess I'm still in the minority, or maybe the only person who thinks this way in the Discord about this kind of like menswear as a hobby. um but we will get to that in the next episode of Sound Direction. I know we've been going on this for a long time, but the next episode is going to be about this menswear as a hobby thing. Hopefully, not too much when Henrik listens to that episode. Hopefully, not too much familiar territory. Um, but it'll be a fun one to kind of cap off the year because we take a break in December. Um,
Oh, yeah,
but
that's good.
yeah, it's gonna be an interesting one, and maybe it'll be a kind of a summary of everything we talked about the past 2 years, and then we'll see what 2023 brings.
I have one more response to what you just
Yeah.
because there was one thing I wanted to say. Because in terms of what it means for others, I think I'm going to be more precise about what I mean. Because
Yeah.
I found out last week that there's a campus WhatsApp group dedicated to my fits.
That's crazy. That's awesome.
Student told me. But it's like, which is like fine or whatever. It's like weird. I didn't really. I guess the thing students do, but didn't ask to see anything about what's going to be.
It's weird because that's like status bestowed to you, then, right?
I suppose, but in the sense that it didn't occur until he said that. It didn't occur to me that it might be like. Well, I guess I should know. It's kind of oblivious, but that no one. It didn't occur to me, or it's not important to me at all that people might be
positive or
having conversations about this when I'm not, online or in a WhatsApp group or something.
Right. That is
the surprise. It really doesn't occur to me while I'm thinking about my relationship to clothing. It has no relevance whatsoever, and I'm always again and again surprised that anyone cares, or that it becomes. I mean, I can sort of understand it now after like a couple of years on Instagram, and there's like suddenly there's like a style forum thread that's devoted to a particular fit, and that happens. It's just bizarre. Anyone cares, but I do realize now that that's actually how a lot of genuinely like people who are like in genuinely creative fields feel like this kind of shock that anyone cares about something that they have made entirely according to their own inclinations, right?
Yeah, that
precisely what resonates is what hasn't been primed for any kind of reception, even
right.
though it's
Yes,
on the horizon.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's kind of the obviously what's kind of happened to me over or some version of that. I guess I have not looked at myself up on Style Forum or asked any about clothes because I'm scared I'm going to see some mean things. Um, but it is all of the esteem, everything that's kind of happened, all the I guess if you want to call it notoriety, is always again so surprising to me because I feel like it could have like there's nothing there. Like I'm not even doing any services. I mean, it's just it's not even like I happen to be. I guess there are some guides that if you want to call it that. There's some early stuff there, but it still is unconventional. And again, yeah, to me that's kind of wild. But then, like you said, like there are when it happens. It just happens to be like that, and I feel like that's kind of gets at my idea of like sometimes status is like retroactive. Like it just kind of you can literally be removed from things as much as you want, and yet you can still have these things happen to you, and it doesn't even have to be a goal that comes up for you. Like there's no, and it's hard obviously now with the internet where you're aware of these goals, you're aware of the accolades that can be bestowed upon you and the esteem and everything. Um, so it is interesting to think about. And someone commented here, what is the byproduct of high status men? I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for that as a way to close this up, but I feel like
What was
to
the question?
me, what is a byproduct of high status men? And I feel like if we were to look, and if I don't know if this person is here for the menswear chat or not. But if I want to relate it to menswear, I feel like to me it has to do a lot with just effect. I mean, I guess we didn't get a chance to talk too much about the effect of high status people, I guess in terms of like making trends. But it is interesting because I was watching the Permanent Style conversation with Ethan Newton, and Ethan Newton does say that the latest this like generation of menswear is interesting because the people who are calling the shots or who have an actual say in what gets made and how style moves are the people like Ethan and Simon versus like a fashion magazine or like a big fashion like a luxury brand. I guess you could relate it to the democratization, but to me again, if we're talking about the byproducts, I mean I feel like it's just a byproduct is like a culture movement. And I don't want to say it's it's not just about like money or whatever, but I feel like there are you should be able to see the effect of high status people that is not just about the following that they have. Like it's not just like it doesn't matter. Like it's like views on YouTube, right? I mean, it's why we measure engagement as a metric. Like it doesn't matter if 100,000 people watch your video if they all didn't do anything with it. That they just clicked, saw it, and left. That doesn't truly mean anything. Um, and so for me, the byproduct is just it just has to be something tangible, and
Is that
that's
your
a
job is to sell that? I didn't know.
I guess so. Yeah, my job is to and that's why being in gaming is such an interesting thing because it's new media, right? People are still only concerned with the eyeballs versus tangible stuff. But of course, that's why the creative marketing team figures out how to make it more tangible to people. That's not my job. But this idea of tangibility is something that we also want to tackle. I mean, not just about learning, which me and Henrik, you and I have talked about before about this, the analog way of learning versus just reading on the internet. That's something that we're going to talk about next year, so I'll have to wait for that as well. But this book has done a lot to kind of expand on the conversation. I mean, again, maybe the biggest critique is that it doesn't really answer anything, but it does give a lot of questions and a lot of thought starters on how to apply it and how to and how we apply it. Um, but I'm gonna end this now. It's been two and a
Yes.
half hours. It's been great. I know we all have to
Thank
do
you.
stuff. But Henrik, thank you for jumping on with us. Thank you
Yeah,
for.
yeah, I'm done. I had a insane day. I'm done.
I
I'm three
know.
beers in. I'm 3 beers in. Done. It's fine. I could go on. It's not a problem. But
This is
I will
what.
leave you to just go.
Yeah, this is what Pasadena is going to be like. We're gonna have to pick a day where I don't have to wake up early the next day, and then
That would be fun. Yeah, I'm sure this
yeah,
to be. I don't know what time you would do. I don't know.
we'll figure it out.
Bars not open that late
No, they
in
don't. I mean, I think the latest is like still like maybe like one. I mean, on a weekday, probably not past midnight. But yeah, again, if you guys want to talk directly with us, you can go to patreon.com/styleanddirection. $5 a month gives you access to our Discord and our backlog of bonus episodes. The one that's about to come out is about Tar, Amsterdam, and See How They Run. So if you like movies, you should listen to that. There's going to be a little blog post with some photos of my favorite outfits from those things. But $10 a month lets us thank you. So obviously thank you to Henrik Wilberg. But MJ, who else are we thanking for their contributions?
We are also thanking Shane Curry, Philip Gregard, Jarrett Collian, and John Clifford.
We appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for, hopefully, if you guys made it this far, I'm sure people have skipped around on this. Yeah, please listen to the more the book focused discussion on style and direction, where Ethan, Spencer, and MJ get to talk about the book, and then you can read my essay, which kind of informs this whole thing. So I guess if you've watched this, I hope you've seen the other stuff first, because this will not make sense if you haven't. But thank you guys so much. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.